Welcome everyone. Good morning. We'll just wait a couple more minutes to let everyone who's registered join the event. Feel free to be voting on the poll, which will be shown on your screen. Really interested to see the results of that. Hi everyone, we'll just wait another minute and then we'll get started. Okay, good morning everyone. We'll get started now. Welcome to the 7th webinar in our Reducing Scope 3 Emissions series. Today we'll be looking at emissions arising from sold products. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank our partners for the series, PA Consulting, Shoesmiths and Owen Mumford. So yeah, you can see everyone's continued to vote on the poll which is shown on your screen. I'll share those results in a second. But just before we do that, I'll run through a little bit of housekeeping for today's session. So firstly, the event is being recorded and I'll send that alongside some key takeaways to all registrants after the webinar. We've also activated automatic captions today, which you can choose to accept in the tools bar. These captions are automatically generated, so please do forgive any typos or mistakes that might be made. We're also in webinar mode today, which means the audience will be muted, but not visible on the screen throughout. But we do still want to hear from you. So any conversations, any useful links which you want to share, please do so in the chat, even if it's just to say hi to everyone as well. And then any questions, if you can make sure that they're put in the Q&A box, because if they're put in the chat box, they most likely won't be asked. Also, any questions in the Q&A box, you'll be able to upvote any ones which you like the look of. Ultimately, the questions with the most upvotes will most likely be asked in the Q&A session at the end of the session. Okay, so just before I hand over to Steve, I'll share the results of the poll, and it's pretty interesting. So hopefully you should be able to see that now. So a main challenge around data availability, with 41% saying that, that's their main challenge. And then secondly, knowledge of methodology, followed by ability to influence and engage customers, and then cost and other as the less popular option. So particularly with those knowledge of methodology and data availability, and hopefully today we'll be able to add something and help you understand a little bit more around that. Okay, so with that, I'm really happy to hand over to Steve Kennedy, the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. Steve, over to you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Welcome everyone. It's great to have you with us today. Seventh in the series. So many of you, I think, have been on this journey all the way through. So thanks for your support. We certainly really appreciate it. What I have to say next is going to be familiar to those of you that have been joining our webinars for a little while, but nonetheless, sadly, still needs to be said. So just a reminder that with all of the other sometimes shocking news that we're exposed to in the media, let's not forget about the horrors that are continuing to unfold in the Ukraine. Millions of people have had to flee the country, millions more displaced within the country. and they need our help. If your business is in a position to help with money or with goods, do please reach out to the UN High Commission on Refugees. That's probably the most reliable vehicle for getting your help to the people that need it the most. There's a link in the chat that you can follow. There's guidance that's been produced by Global Compact with the UN OCHA and the Connecting Business Initiative that might help you better understand how you can make a useful contribution. Anything you can do would obviously be gratefully received. Okay, let's move on now to my next bit of housekeeping. And again, just for those of you that are perhaps not familiar with the UN Global Compact, we are the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. We have over 16,000 companies around the world, 4,000 more non-business organizations that have made a commitment to our 10 universal principles of corporate sustainability. These principles are derived from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption, truly relevant all around the world. We have more than 70 local networks, and it's our role to turn this global commitments on sustainability into practical action. Here in the UK, we have 3 work streams: business and human rights, climate action, and global goals. We deliver around 100 events a year to support our members and the wider business community in achieving the SDGs and corporate sustainability more generally. To join the Global Compact, if you're not already in an organization that's participating, your CEO needs to make 3 commitments. Firstly, to operationalize the Global Compact principles throughout your operations. Secondly, to report annually on the progress you're making towards that end. And finally, to support the wider UN development agenda, which at the moment is best defined by the Sustainable Development Goals. If you want more information, there's, once again, I hope there's going to be a link in the chat. Do get in touch with us either through the chat. You can direct message me or reach out through our website. We'd be really happy to speak with you. Okay, on to the order for today. We have, as always, a fantastic lineup of speakers, and we're going to do our best today to illuminate how best to measure and reduce Scope 3 emissions associated with sold products. First, we're going to hear from Emma Watson. She is the Net Zero Senior Manager at CDP, as well as at the Science Based Targets Initiative. We're then going to hear from Emma Darroch, Responsible Business Manager at Sky. And finally, Mark Lancelott, Consulting Director at PA Consulting. And I think without any further ado, let's get stuck in. So I'm delighted to hand over to Emma Watson. Emma.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone. So I'm looking forward to talking to you today about Scope 3 target setting, and more specifically on the use of sold products. But first, I'll give you a quick introduction to the Science Based Targets Initiative if we go on to the next slide. So the Science Based Targets Initiative was formed around the time of the Paris Agreement. We are a partner organisation, so made up of representatives from 4 different NGOs. I'm from CDP, and we have colleagues from the UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, and WWF. So since the launch of the Science Based Targets Initiative in 2015, we now have over 3,000 companies that are part of the initiative who've made commitments to setting science-based targets in line with the latest climate science and alignment with the Paris Agreement commitments. And around about half of them have had their targets approved. So it's great to see the momentum in the space that's happened over the last few years. Now, what are science-based targets? So if we go on to the next slide, thank you very much. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative, until very recently, has focused very much on what we now call near-term science-based targets. So these are 5 to 10-year targets that show your company how much and how quickly you need to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions to be in line with the Paris Agreement commitments. So As of next month, we will only be accepting targets that are aligned to 1.5C. So that is a ramp up in ambition for companies as of next month. We also released the net zero standard in October of last year. So that is a long-term target that shows companies how much they need to be reducing their emissions to be in line with global net zero scenarios that limit warming to 1.5C. So really, these long-term targets are very useful for companies to understand the direction that they need to be heading in, and provides that kind of North Star for long-term strategic and investment decisions to make the systematic changes that are needed for us to reach net zero as a society. And then companies are also required to disclose their emissions on an annual basis to understand how they are progressing with achieving their science-based targets as well. So that's a bit about Science-Based Targets Initiative and what science-based targets are. Now I'll go into more about Scope 3 target setting. So when companies are setting Scope 3 targets as part of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, there are 4 things that they need to really take into account. And we've split this into the near-term science-based targets and the long-term science-based targets. So if we think back to the last slide, I had that split out into the near-term, which is 5 to 10 years. And then the long-term is what companies need to achieve to be in line with the net zero scenarios that limit warming to 1.5C. So we do have differences as well between the requirements for Scope 1 and 2 and Scope 3. And that's really because there are challenges related to Scope 3 target setting, in particular with data availability, which we saw in the poll earlier, but also influence and many other factors as well. So we do allow for this greater flexibility, but at a minimum, companies have to complete a Scope 3 screening. So that is at minimum an estimation of all of your value chain emissions to understand where the hotspots are, which categories of Scope 3 are relevant to you. So going back to the considerations for setting science-based targets. So the first thing that companies need to think about is the boundary of the targets. And we're actually going to go into this for use of soil products in quite a lot of detail today, because it tends to be the sticking area for this Scope 3 category. So how much does a company need to cover of their emissions inventory in the near term? So that's 67%. If Scope 3 is over 40% of their total footprint. So what that means is some really heavy emitters that have very high proportion of Scope 1 and 2, they won't actually have to include Scope 3. But most companies, Scope 3 makes up over 85% of their footprint. So most companies will have to cover 67% of their Scope 3 emissions within their target at minimum. For Scope 3, it's simple. Have to cover 90% of your Scope 3 emissions. Sorry, for the long term, it's simple. When we're looking at the level of ambition for near-term science-based targets, Scope 3 has to align with well below 2C, and that will remain the same actually in July. So when we switch to 1.5C as an initiative, that actually only applies to Scope 1 and 2. Well below 2C targets will still be allowed for Scope 3. For long-term science-based targets, all 3 scopes must align with 1.5C, and that's because we're aiming for that global net zero goal of limiting warming to 1.5C. The time frame that we're looking at, so near-term targets, they're 5 to 10 year targets, and long-term targets, they're 2050 latest. If you're in the power sector, that's an exception to that, and the power sector has to reach net zero faster, so they're required to get there by 2040. And then finally, there are a variety of methods that are available for setting science-based targets. In the near term, we've got 5 different methods that are allowed. So absolute reductions, we have sector-specific intensity targets, supplier and customer engagement targets, and then we have both economic and physical intensity targets. for Scope 3 in the near term. In the long term, all of those methods are available apart from the supplier or customer engagement targets. So it's basically just your absolute, your sector specific, and then those economic and physical intensity targets. So I won't go into those in too much detail at all today, but you can play around with the SBTI tools to see what that actually means and look at our net zero standards, the corporate manual, to find out more about these specific methods. Great. So when we're looking at use of solid products, so this is an excerpt from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3 standards. So I apologize for the very wordy slide, but this is the description of the use of solid products category within the GHG Protocol. So what this category covers is the end use of goods and services sold by the reporting company in the reporting year. So what the Greenhouse Gas Protocol does is it also outlines minimum boundaries. So that's what companies are required to include, is mandatory, and then optional boundaries as well. So what is absolutely required for companies to include would be the direct use phase of emissions of sold products over their expected lifetime. So what that means is the Scope 1 and 2 emissions of the end users that occur from the use of products that directly consume energy. And we'll talk about this in a bit more detail in the next slide. During use, they are fuels and feedstocks, they're greenhouse gases themselves, or they're products that contain or form greenhouse gases that are emitted during use. So this is a bit much to take in, so we'll go into this on the next slide. Oh, sorry, just back one, thank you. And then, so the optional boundary is the indirect use phase emissions from sold products over their expected lifetime. So these are the emissions from the use of products that indirectly consume energy. So that would be fuels or electricity during use. So what is the difference between indirect use phase and direct use phase? Let's go on to the next slide, please. So this table is also from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It's table 5.8. The previous table was table 5.4. So this just gives you basically what's shown in the previous table, broken down into a much more easy to digest format, but it also gives you some examples. And of course, examples are what really brings it to life. So the direct use phase emissions, again, so the types of products that would sit under this would be products that directly consume energy during their use. So they're directly consuming fuels or electricity. So that would be, you know, cars, airplanes, engines, motors, buildings. They do consume energy during use. That's sometimes a tricky one to kind of grasp, but they come under this category. Appliances, electronics, lighting, data center, etc., etc. So this product that a company is selling, it actually consumes fuel or electricity. Then, of course, there's fuels and feedstocks themselves. So if you're an oil and gas company or a coal mining company, you're actually selling a product that is producing greenhouse gas emissions itself. That sits under the category and it is direct. And then there's other greenhouse gases or products that contain or form greenhouse gases. So a common one here would be refrigeration and air conditioning equipment, or maybe fertilizers as well. So that's kind of sits under there. So what you can see is that it's very direct. Then when you're looking at indirect, this is more things like clothes. So clothes, they're not actually using energy for you to wear them, but you do need to wash them and dry them. Food, you need to refrigerate it and cook it. So the food isn't actually taking any energy in like a car, but in order to prepare it, you may need to use it. So these are optional because they tend to be extremely hard for companies to calculate and influence. And hopefully now you can see the difference between indirect and direct use phase emissions. So if we go on to the next slide, thank you very much. So it's important to understand the difference between indirect and direct use phase emissions for Scope 3 target setting, because those indirect use phase emissions, they're optional. So if you feel like you can influence these emissions, you feel like you can reduce them, then we do encourage companies to set targets on these emissions. But because they're optional, they don't count towards that 67% or 2/3 boundary that I mentioned a few slides ago in the near term, and they don't count towards that 90% boundary in the long term. So if you are setting targets on indirect use phase emissions, that comes on top of your regular mandatory emissions inventory. Now, I'll run through a quick example with you, and hopefully this will bring it slightly more to life. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So here, I've given an example of a company called Pukka Herbs. So Pukka, they set their science-based targets a few years ago, and their target was to reduce their Scope 1 and 2 emissions 100% by 2030. And then they also committed to reduce their Scope 3 emissions from crop to cup 50% per million units of product by 2030. So what you can see both on the left-hand side and the right-hand side is a breakdown of Pukka's carbon footprint. And here they haven't used their greenhouse gas protocol Scope 3 categories. They've kind of made it much more easy for everyone to understand. So they've broken it down into supply chain, logistics, offices and warehouse, distribution, kettle boiling, and end of life. Now, kettle boiling, because the cup of tea or the tea bag, it doesn't actually consume energy itself. You need to turn on the kettle, which actually consumes energy, to boil water and then to make your tea. So that's indirect use phase. So they don't actually have to account for these kettle boiling emissions within their footprint. However, they felt that it was very important to do so, and therefore it was included in the footprint. So what happens though when you're doing these calculations is that it's always fun to play with percentages. And so you can see the percentages there on the left-hand side of the graph, the slide, with the kettle boiling in red. Now, if we go on to the next slide, we can see that when we remove the kettle boiling from the footprint actually looks very different. And you're going to need to include additional categories to be able to make up that 67%. So it's always important just to, use the mandatory emissions as your denominator when calculating the coverage of your Scope 3 footprint. So hopefully that brings it to life a bit more. It might have confused some people as well, but happy to answer any questions. And I think the next slide has some resources for you to kind of explore on your own. But yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass over to Steve now.
Thanks, Emma. That was fantastic. I think this is going to likely be our most watched recording going forward. Really complicated and a lot to absorb there, but I think you that was really brilliant. Thanks for presenting it so clearly. Before we go on to Emma, Darroch, just a quick reminder to everybody, please put your questions for the audience or for the panel in the Q&A box. We've already got a fairly insane number of questions there. It's going to be challenging to get through them all. And so we're really going to have to rely upon the upvote system. So post your questions into the Q&A box. Please keep an eye in there yourself. If you see a question that looks really interesting to you, click on the thumbs up. That's going to move it up to the top of the screen for me. And that's going to be more likely that I'm going to post that question to our panelists. So already 28 open questions. So really important that you help us out by letting us know what you're most interested in having us talk about. And if your questions aren't in the Q&A box, if you put them into the chat, I'm afraid it's a pretty much guarantee we're not going to be addressing that directly. So thanks very much for taking care of that. Okay, onwards and upwards. Emma, Darroch, over to you.
Hi, thanks Patrick, Steve and Emma, and good morning everyone. Just want to say thanks to the UN Global Compact for hosting this webinar series again this year. Clearly it's a valuable resource. So yeah, thanks for inviting Sky to talk about our way in which we've been reporting on our use of soil products and what we've been doing to reduce the impacts. So yeah, I'm Emma, a responsible business manager at Sky. My focus is Scope 3 reporting with in particular on the use phase and how our products are reported. I've got 10 minutes today to run through this, so I'm going to keep things quite high level, but if anyone's got any questions, please, as Steve said, put them in the Q&A. So for anyone that doesn't know Sky, we're one of Europe's leading media and entertainment companies, and we are proud to be part of the Comcast Corporation. Across 6 countries, our innovative products serve our 23 million customers, connecting them to the best apps, entertainment, sports and news, and arts that they love, including our own award-winning original content. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to go through today. I'm going to take you through our science-based target and then our net zero strategy and how this has informed that. I'm going to talk about our Scope 3 footprint and then what soil products makes up of that footprint. Then I'm going to explain the methodology and how we've interpreted and employed the Greenhouse Gas Protocol at Sky. Then I'm going to talk about the levers of change that we've identified on reporting on soil products across data refinements and building more efficient products. And then I'm going to talk a bit about life cycle assessments and their role, and then key takeaways and lessons learned. Next slide, please. So we set our near-term science-based target in December 2020, and it was approved in April 2021. We set an absolute target using the cross-sector pathway, and this has been validated by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and we're preparing on the net zero standard next. As you know, reductions will be required across a company's entire value chain, so our scopes 1, 2, and 3. But then we will be turning to carbon removals to neutralise any unavoidable emissions at a maximum of 10% by 2050. Next slide, please. And it's our science-based target that really underpins our Sky Zero strategy, and in particular, the first pillar of transforming our business. So in transforming our business, we will be cutting our carbon emissions created by our business, our suppliers, and the use of our tech products, which is very important to this webinar today, by at least 50% against our 2018 baseline. We will also be building a portfolio of natural carbon sinks so that we can balance out our footprint from 2030 whilst we continue to reduce to 2050. It's also really important to us that we use our voice to drive change. So we will be leading our sector to deliver meaningful change through our content and our collective platforms and championing global standards for climate and nature. And finally, as we've got 23 million customers, we want to mobilize millions to go zero. It's really important for us to work with our partners and our channels, shows and campaigns to educate, enable and encourage people to join us and go zero. Next slide, please. So we've been reporting our carbon emissions in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol methodology since the early 2000s, and we've been carbon neutral as an organisation across Scope 1, 2 and the relevant parts of Scope 3 since 2006. We began reporting on an annual basis. We report on an annual basis with assurance across Scopes 1 and 2, and then our next kind of objective is to be assuring our Scope 3. And we began reporting on our Scope 3 in 2016. So as you can see, our 2021 Scope 3 footprint was just shy of 2.5 million tonnes. And this makes up about 96 to 98% of our overall Scopes 1, 2 and 3. So Scope 3 for us is the most material and what we're kind of really putting our energy towards tackling. And as you can see there, of category 11, use of soil products, is responsible for 50% of our overall scope 3. So it's, as I said, it's very material. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about how we account for it on the next slide, please. So when I talk about our products, I'm referring to our tech products, which include our Sky Q family, which is our set-top box family, our streaming devices, such as the Puck, all of our broadband and routers, including our sister brother company Now. You might have heard of it as Now TV, all of the hardware that supports our customers for Now, and then also all of our mobiles sold under Sky Mobile. So what's the fundamental thing about our products is they all require electricity to run. And what's unique to us about how we account for this category is some of our products are customer owned. So we sell them and they become customer owned. The customer owns the device. However, another set of our products are lease products. So we actually own the hardware. So we lease the product to the customer and then we receive it back at the end of their time of using the product, and then we refurbish it, and then we're able to release that out to new customers. And what this means is in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, you can account for your leased assets and your sold products in category 11 use of sold products. And that's what we do because it makes most sense to our business that we account for these together, given the nuances around customer owning the product and Sky owning the product. So in order to calculate the emissions associated with all of these products, we obviously need to collect data across a set of data points. And these data points kind of fall in 4 key areas. So firstly, we need to know what volume of devices is out there, whether those be active or sold. As I said, the active devices as part of our lease model, and then our sold devices being those that are sold and now customer owned. We need to calculate the annual power consumption of our devices, and this is made up of 2 key bits of information. The first key bit of information is the power consumption profiles of the device. So many of you might be aware that devices have different power modes, and they can kind of range from a standard on, standby, off to more modes, which include passive standby and low power mode, or also known as eco mode. So we need to know exactly what wattage are those products running in when they're running in that mode. And then to calculate the annual power consumption, we need to know how many hours are they in each of those modes. So for example, they might be on for 5 hours, passive standby for 6, off, etc., etc. Then for sold products, because you need to account for the lifetime of the product up front, because the customer owns the product, we need to know how long is the product going to be in its lifetime for: 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. And then finally, we need to know our emissions factors. What do we want to be applying per geography to account for the emissions of the product's electricity use? And we draw on DEFRA and IEA emissions factors to do this. And then we use a carbon accounting software that we run in-house, that we take all of this information into and we plug into our software, which is what calculates the impact. We were working in Excel, and we had a product model that was doing all of this, but serving 23 million customers is a lot of products to keep track of. So we've upgraded this and taken it digital, which has helped massively with tracking just a huge vast of data across these 4 buckets. Next slide, please. So we sort of see levers of change on impacting this category, the calculation of it and the refinement of that, but also the action towards reducing the source of the emissions that our products are responsible for. So in the data refinement piece, this sort of sits across 3 key areas. So the first key area is volumes. How can we leverage product analytics data to give us the most accurate picture of what devices out there are active and running? It's one thing the devices being manufactured from the warehouse, but it's another thing them actually being connected. Devices might be sat in engineers' vans, they might be sitting in the warehouse, they're not up and running. So we want to make sure we are accounting for what is actually in use, rather than maybe just on its way to a customer or being returned from a customer. The second piece is really having a kind of formalized process of updated testing of your power consumption of your devices. So when we, and I'm going to talk about this a bit in a moment, when we have, when we're updating the energy efficiency of our devices, are we making sure that we are testing those to make sure we've got the accurate picture on what that new power wattage looks like with new software rollouts? And then finally, we want to understand more about our product use. I explained earlier how we have to account for the products being in certain modes for a certain amount of time. How can we use telemetry data from our boxes that's telling us, okay, on average, boxes are in active for this many minutes, and then they're in active standby for this many minutes. And it's that granularity over understanding product behavior that's going to help us track better how are our customers using our products, and how is that being tied into our accounting. So then the second bucket of change, I guess, is around how can we build the most efficient product? And we see this in sort of three key areas. The first area being on new products, how are we ensuring that they're being designed and built in the most energy efficient way? A recent kind of upgrade of ours is the low power mode, of which the devices go into a kind of ultra low power mode between 1 and 5 a.m. overnight. So that's bringing that power consumption down, which would have otherwise been much higher. The second is on our existing products. As I said before, we've got products that are sold and leased, but because of the way in which we are able to impact the product from afar, as technology gets better, how are we rolling out energy efficiency updates to impact those products as throughout their lifetime? And then finally, an approach that's been really core to us building the most efficient products has been embedding life cycle assessment into our practices. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So hopefully you're all aware of what life cycle assessments are, but fundamentally it's a way in which you can analyze the impact of a product or service from cradle to grave. So looking at everything from product design, components, manufacture, packaging, then how is it distributed, the use of the product, and then how is it at its end of life, how is it processed at end of life. And we've been conducting LCAs of our products for a long time because we think it's important for us to understand where the biggest impacts occur and how to intervene in these processes. We also think it's important to conduct LCAs so that we can really frame and communicate to stakeholders how they are impacting every part of the process. And in this, LCAs map lots of different aspects of the product's impact, but in the sense of using them for carbon for our reporting, how are they impacting the carbon footprint of the product? And then finally, LCAs we believe are really important because it allows us to internally benchmark the products that we create, and it allows us to challenge ourselves to develop more efficient products time after time as our portfolio grows. Next slide, please. So I guess just a key takeaways and lessons learned would be improved data allows us to prioritize and drive the right change. And it's that transparency piece on trying to strive for the most accuracy as possible, but not letting that get in the way. Don't let perfect get in the way of better, but making sure that you're keeping a really as accurate as possible track of what you've done, what data have you collected, what impact has it had. When you're putting together so many sources, it can be easy to lose track. The second thing is consistency. We often reinstate our data when we know we've got access to better data and insights. Sometimes when you're in that reporting year, you can't always quickly turn around and leverage something that you think is going to actually be quite material. So not being afraid to reinstate data and striving to continually improve. Third massive kind of important bit in this is teamwork. My role is reporting and kind of holding the single point of truth on what we publish, but I work across the business to engage so many stakeholders that work all along the product piece, and working alongside my peers in my team who work on scope 1 and 2 is a lot of there's a lot of learnings that we can share and kind of encourage best practice. And then finally, kind of perseverance. The road to net zero and achieving your science-based target is not linear, and kind of just focusing on building year on year. And reporting and really accurate measurement is definitely really important, but it's got to be that balance between measurement and action. We can keep measuring and not bring down emissions at all. So trying to keep it front of mind that measurement's important, but it's got to be balanced with action. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Fantastic again. Still some questions going into the chat box. Please direct them into the Q&A box. Another added benefit of putting them in the Q&A box is it enables our panelists to perhaps do a written answer. And for some of these questions, that might be a more efficient approach to getting them answered. And Emma, you generated a lot of questions, some of them quite specific. So it would be great if you could cast an eye down. A lot of interest in what software you're using, for example. All right, now we're going to hand over to Mark to wrap things up. Mark doesn't have any slides, so don't panic when you only see Mark's face on your screen, and then we'll move on to our Q&A session when Mark's done. Mark, over to you.
Super. So thanks, Steve. Thanks, Patrick at Young Global Compact, and also to Emma Watson and Emma Darroch. And I'm going to embrace Emma's comment there about measurement being a means to an end, and I'm going to talk much more about examples of companies I work with in terms of what actions they're taking to reduce emissions in the kind of sole product phase. So just briefly, so I'm with PA Consulting, based up near Manchester, northwest of England. We're an innovation consultancy of around 4,000 people globally. Our mission is to create a positive human future. We do what a large consultancy would do, but we also do product technology, innovation, product design as well. And my focus is around helping businesses become more sustainable. So I do a lot of work around circularity and sustainability through strategy, business models, proposition innovation. Work closely with Ellen MacArthur Foundation and with UN Global Compact, both with Steve and the UK network, but also globally out of New York on things like Project Breakthrough and helping set up the Young SDG Innovators Programme. So I'm going to talk to sort of 3 examples that are anonymised, but they're kind of based on companies I work with and know well. So I'm going to talk a bit about retail, secondly about consumer goods, and thirdly about sort of manufacturing more in a B2B context. And just talk a bit about what they're doing and some of the actions they're taking, and also a little bit of a reflection in terms of what that means in terms of reporting and scope 3 and the different categories we've talked about here today. So the first example is a large retailer we've been working with. So they're the largest in their country. So it's a non-UK retailer working across a range of product categories. So most categories, to be honest, apart from fresh food. Quite ambitious in terms of sustainability and taking a lead. A lot of that's been focused around, I suppose, kind of sourcing products with sustainability attributes. So it's a kind of quite a supply chain focus historically. And the work we've been doing with them is really kind of help them think about how you think about the kind of upstream view around scope 3, how you can take action to reduce emissions there. They're in the process of setting and committing publicly to scope 3 targets and a net zero target. But the big shift for them has really been to think about, what's our role in helping consumers live sustainably, and how can we extend what we do to have impact there, which plays into the sort of direct and indirect use phases that Emma just talked about, but also more broadly, I think, into sort of scope 3 and avoided emissions. So to talk about some of the practical things they're doing and planning to do more of going forward. Firstly, a key piece around general education and carbon literacy. So how to help consumers understand the impact of their purchasing behaviours and how they use products. We did some research last year which resonated with other views and research that we know and what we hear from brands and retailers working in this space. But the the message would be for mainstream consumers now, they increasingly care about sustainability if you ask them. If you then start to scratch your way under the surface in terms of what that practically means, there's still a lot of confusion there in terms of what I should practically do in my busy life to take action. So very much looking for help from brands and retailers to make it easy to live more sustainably. So that really is that piece around education and understanding. And then we think about, well, what does it mean practically? So if I'm a retailer, if I'm selling products, how can I start to present practical, informative, relevant, accessible information about the products I'm thinking about buying, and how might I use them? So, there's things like energy ratings, which we'll be familiar with if we're buying a washing machine or a TV. How can I do that same concept for other products? But also, how can I present that perhaps in a different way? So rather than giving it a rating A, B, C, D, E, F, how can I think about what the kind of cost saving might be over kind of a total lifetime around that? So how can I translate it into things that are more relevant to my purchasing decision? And also then starting to think about, well, how might I use the product in a more energy efficient or more sustainable way, which might be about power modes, it might be about time of day, but to make that information more accessible. The third thing they're looking at is very much that the role in the product offerings and product ranges. So how do they better present and offer the right products which customers can use to live more sustainably? Which starts to kind of move a little bit more into thinking about overall Scope 3 and kind of upstream footprint as well as downstream. Gets into things like longer life. I know there's a question on the chat about that. So if I, as a provider, if I extend the life of a product, that's going to increase the emissions in that side, but overall across all of this kind of Scope 3 and thinking about avoided emissions, there's potentially a bigger impact there. So how do I present that, and the question on how do I report and account for it? And then the last piece then really is around thinking about the role as a retailer in supporting that product use phase. So can I start to offer repair services in my retail outlets to extend product life? Can I offer products as a service or a subscription model, which might be more kind of pay per use, and some of the dynamics that can create, which can drive sustainability done in the right way? And how can I think about things like take back, refurbishment and recycling? And again, how does that play into reporting for this category versus the broader footprint around that? So those are some practical examples of what they're looking to do. Probably we're saying, how to best position these types of services and offerings is a process of experimentation and innovation. So it's very much embracing that mindset of how do we test and learn through doing to work out what's going to be right for our consumers and how it's going to help them live more sustainably, and how do we do that in a way that makes commercial sense for us and plays back into the commitments we want to set around net zero and Scope 3 emissions reduction. So that's the first example. Second example I was going to talk to is more in the consumer goods space, and particularly thinking about washing and clothing. So I saw yesterday, it's popped up in my Twitter feed, promoted tweets from Purcell around sort of hashtag wash cold challenge. It keeps popping up for some reason, so I'm not quite sure what I've clicked on to drive that into my Twitter feed. But this really idea around moving to think about how I wash clothes. So the example I wanted to get into here was this idea of partnerships and coalitions. So you may have come across this 50-litre water coalition, which is focused on how to reduce usage of water in domestic properties, which I think is currently average is around between 500 and 600 litres a day. So how do we reduce it down to 50 litres? And this coalition, includes the likes of P&G, Electrolux, energy providers like NG, IKEA, Grundfos, etc. So it's really across that whole ecosystem of people who are providing in products, so white good products or into kind of detergents or the energy into the home, and thinking about how can we reduce down water consumption and heating associated with that, but also the emissions footprint of getting water into the house and the kind of treatment after it. So, we can start to think about, well, if I'm a provider of washing machines like Electrolux, that starts to get into how I reduce the direct use phase, Scope 3. If I provide detergents, so back to the kind of personal example, if I can encourage people to use colder water in the wash, I'm kind of into the indirect use phase there. So I think interesting in terms of starting to see a range of players try and come down and focus on the sort of consumer behavior and needs, which is the thing that is driving some of the emissions, and trying to find ways of coming together to solve that and reduce kind of overall emissions through that. The other thing I'll just kind of mention here is this kind of idea around product life extension. And again, I know there's a question in the chat around that, and what's kind of interplay between different categories in Scope 3 and overall emissions. So I suppose the kind of key point here is kind of, at the moment, it's quite a lack of real data that's going to inform, granular enough emissions factors to help people think through this. So the only one I'm aware of, and I don't think it's been published yet, but I've been told about some relatively recent research looking at the impact of doubling life extension of clothing. And the kind of headline I've heard is, that's if you double life, overall sort of reduction of 40% plus in total carbon footprint. And I guess the point is, having that kind of data sets for different products to understand the impact of extending product life starts to then enable some choices around how to design, how to offer products, how to encourage consumers to use it in a different way, and have the data then to start to think about how can we actually report and measure that in a way that perhaps we can't at the moment. And then the third example I wanted to talk to was more in so it's kind of business to business setting. So from work we've done recently with a sort of large manufacturer across a few different industry sectors, starting to really experience pressure from their customers to reduce the footprint of the products that they provide, and also about resource intensity and waste and product stewardship concerns, and starting to get this demand for the kind of circular solutions through. So they're starting to do things like, LCAs across their whole product range, thinking about how they embed guidance into the design and engineering standards that they use, that considers use phase and end of life, and how can they build that into their product roadmaps going forward. But one of the practical challenges they're wrestling with at the moment is, if I make a device, is it better for me to focus on improving the energy efficiency and reducing that, or actually is it better to, if I could create a device that maybe it's got a higher energy consumption but an even higher throughput, so the emissions footprint per item or per unit is lower, and how do I work through that trade-off, and then how do I think about that in terms of reporting it? So my emissions per machine sold might increase, but overall you'd expect there to be fewer machines needed for the same throughput. So how do I account for that? And that starts then to play into things like the kind of commercial offer. So do I stick with a selling an asset, or do I move to some kind of pay-per-use product as a service type model around that? And there's similar debates in that if we think about asset sharing models to things like kind of car sharing, or even kind of fashion, renting fashion, things like that. So those are the sort of 3 examples I was going to talk to. I could delve a little bit more into the sort of food if it kind of comes up in the chat, but really wanted to kind of summarize in terms of, what I'm seeing is some companies now really starting to think about how this works at a system perspective and how to bring together different parts of the ecosystem to start to solve this, and look at the kind of overall sort of reduction, thinking across upstream and downstream. Therefore, we're getting this complexity around how I look at this depending on where I sit in the value chain. Secondly, this need for better data to really start to inform action. So some of that isn't just about measurement and reporting, but it's to inform design choices and service choices. Talked a bit about product life extension and asset utilization, and then this piece around how the interplay between different categories within Scope 3 and elsewhere, and how you can navigate through that. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share. I hope that's informative. Really can hand back to you, Steve, now, and into the Q&A.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, you've given us a great prep, I think, for many of the top questions that are coming in. But I think in so many respects, we're raising some really big questions that people are going to have to grapple with beyond the more micro granular stuff about measurement. But Emma pointing out, Emma Watson right at the start, the indirect versus direct, and what's required for a science-based target, but actually what might be required rather to have a greater impact on climate, and not perversely not necessarily the same thing. And some of these questions around, yeah, there are some perverse outcomes. And our top question, so you touched on this, Mark, but I wanted to give the Emmas a chance to comment as well about this extending product life, because obviously that would intuitively be a positive thing. Everybody would think so, and yet it seems to lead to perverse, perhaps negative perceptions in reporting. So I want to combine the question from Karen that's got the most votes, but also the question from Joachim that's just below. So Karen, for those that can't see this, Karen asks, one of the questions we regularly get is that if we have to report lifetime emissions, then if we make a product longer lasting, our Scope 3 goes up. And Joachim asks, the EU Commission is pushing for increasing durability and lifetime of products. However, a longer lifespan means increasing emissions according to the greenhouse gas protocols. Is that correctly understood, and how do we solve this challenge? So maybe Emma Watson, could you start us off, maybe, if there's a straightforward SBTI solution to this?
Yeah, well, I think Mark kind of touched on it in his presentation just then, but it does definitely, in many cases, increase the use of sold products emissions if your product is lasting longer. If you think about, I guess, the old phones that did last longer, you had that for many years, and over that time you would use a lot of charge. But then nowadays you have to, replace your phone like every 2 years or something like that. But that means, I guess, on the other, I guess if we're looking at this example from the other side, it means that more metals are mined, more, manufacturing emissions, et cetera, So that is where you'd see the impact, as Mark kind of said, you see that in your supply chain emissions going down, because you're actually having to produce less products because they'll last longer and the customer is able to use it for many more years. So it should be balanced out. There are categories of emissions, I think, when it doesn't actually balance out in the greenhouse gas protocol, and the greenhouse gas protocol, I would say, is not necessarily fit for purpose. So if we think about when you buy something, and this is going into a different category, going into purchase goods and services category 1, But if you buy any product, even if it's secondhand, you have to account for the emissions from cradle to gate. So from when it's, I guess, taken out of the ground, the materials are taken out of the ground, to when you buy it at the shop. So if you're buying a secondhand, item of clothing, you are actually going to have larger, and it's probably marginal, but marginally larger emissions than when you bought it from, Marks and Spencer's or whatever, because there's actually been an added emissions of that then going to the charity shop. So in that respect, sometimes the greenhouse gas protocol isn't fit for purpose and isn't very conducive to, circular economy thinking. And so we're having we're doing a lot of thinking about that at the SBTI, how we can overcome that, and looking at different metrics for scope 3 target setting that would allow that kind of change to happen. So, for example, one of them being 100% circular products. That could be a target that a company could have under the SBTI. It's something that we're very much in the early stages of thinking, but yeah, just want to say that sometimes it isn't fit for purpose, and we do need to think about these things like more logically.
Emma, Darroch, you're doing life cycle analysis. Are these questions that you've taken on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's why investing in doing life cycle assessments is really important, because if you can't see the cradle to grave impacts, how can you know how you're going to impact them? I think on the extended producer responsibility for connected devices, because we've got the ability to sorry, it's not extended producer responsibility. It was the EU Commission pushing for increased durability. Apologies, I'm reading all the questions at the same time. So for us, because we've got the ability to impact the firmware of our devices, rolling out efficiency updates, having it as a leased product means we can account for it year on year. So the power consumption of the device might not be the same in the first year that it is in the medium term. But for the devices that we sell and the customer owns them, we've got to account for the power consumption of that device upfront for its lifetime in the first year. And that's where the greenhouse gas protocol is unfortunately limited, in the sense that we can't, if we know that the energy efficiency of the product is going to improve over time, and driven by the fact that we know this through doing LCAs, we can't account for that in our accounting. We have to account for it up front. And I think that there's lots of exciting work coming down the line with it from industry on how we need to better account for connected devices. I can't speak for other types of products because I don't work on those specifically, but my advice would be, if you can invest in conducting LCAs of your products, it definitely helps to cajole all those working along the product to view carbon front of mind. Of course, carbon is not the most important factor, but I think that's what leads to Emma's point about, if you're making better, more durable products, the likelihood is that you're then selling less. So hopefully there's a balancing there.
Yeah, I think that's probably it, isn't it? Mark, any final words on this before we?
Yeah, so I think the key thing that Emma said, it's like measurement as a means to an end, and we have to recognise that it's a hugely complex topic trying to measure this, and how we do it in the guidance is going to evolve and improve. So we need to focus on trying to do the right thing and recognise, that you just do kind of the life cycle view, the total view. How do we take action on that? How are we going to address the kind of climate changes that the overall aim we're trying to do here? And that should be the North Star. We kind of measure to inform what we do and make better actions, and then we have to report and recognise there'll be imperfections that will gradually get better as we go forward. Okay, thank you. I think that's a really, really big question, and obviously it got a lot of votes. Now the next one, a bit general, but from Mila: if we are selling a service, how do we calculate emissions from this? Let's maybe be more specific even and say, if we were
for example, a travel agency? Because there was a question earlier on or further down in the list about, you know, selling seats on planes. But generally speaking, in selling a service, are there sold product implications? That kind of feels like not, but this, Emma, you guys sell services, and
yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Well, I think the example I'm gonna use is streaming. So the world of streaming is obviously expanding massively, and customers are able to stream services such as Sky Go now through a device that is not owned by Sky. So this is where the methodology kind of improvements, taking into consideration what Mark's just said, is going to be so important as reporting evolves. We are part of a consortium called DIMPACT, which is a set of streamers, device manufacturers, but also PSBs in the UK. DIMPACT's come up with a methodology of how can we account for streaming. And a part of that streaming is accounting for streaming is taking into account the devices that the products are used on, but we don't own those devices. So strictly in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, it's sort of becoming this scope 4. How, and what we're working on is how can we disaggregate the impacts of our streaming services from our scope 1, 2, and 3. But this is kind of fairly new, and that's why it's really great to work together with your peers to kind of try to define where your boundaries sit in terms of the services that you sell or are impacted by.
Okay. Emma, Mark, anything to add on that? It feels a little bit like it might be different categories as opposed to this one. Is that the short answer?
I think in a lot of, like, if we take, I guess what I would say is like maybe the simplest example of a service would be like a consultancy. So a consultancy, if you're procuring that service, the emissions that arise from that service would be from, you know, their offices, and that would count under the consultancy scope 1 and 2. Maybe they have some business travel trying to get to your office, and then I guess yeah, otherwise it would be like their brain. So it does depend on the different kind of service that you're procuring, and as you say, Steve, a lot of the time it does end up coming in other categories for that supplier.
And just to add, so you know, there's growing interest in this sort of scope 4 concept, sorry, where, you know, across a range of industries I see now where businesses are seeing their customers asking for this, and it's almost viewed as a commercial opportunity. So how can we help them use our products and services in a better way, or how can we provide services that help our customers become more sustainable or decarbonized in a way? And it's driven from that perspective rather than a sort of carbon target or reporting perspective. And clearly you expect it in some time it'll come together, but it's this idea of the commercial opportunity around sustainability and trying to help customers improve what they want to do.
So we do have a question near the top from Karen about guidelines on scope 4. Emma Watson, is SBTi looking at that? Anything in the pipeline that we have to look forward to, or is that still quite a nebulous idea?
Yeah, it's still a nebulous idea. I mean, from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, I believe they had a paper, it's something about avoided emissions. I can't remember the title off the top of my head. And that's on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website. And it's kind of like 3 pages about basically why this is very difficult. I have actually heard that they might be updating that paper next year. And they're also going to be going into the process of updating the scope 3 standard as well. But scope 4, I think, is often like more of an industry-led kind of initiatives, because I think they're all very unique. There's lots going on, like with advertising as well. That seems to be one of the key industries that there is. But yeah, not from our side.
Okay, well, and thank you, Alexandra, for getting a link to that report into the chat. so quickly. So everybody can check that out, and we've taken care of another question. Okay, you touched on this right at the beginning, Emma, this question from Eugene Bryce. Interested in scope 3 for a construction company. Are they responsible for the emissions of what they build? For how long? Do they report the total forever or add the actual yearly estimate each year? Are there some boundaries on this? You did speak about construction, as I recall, right at the start.
Which Emma was it?
Yeah, Emma Watson, sorry.
Oh, okay. So construction companies, it kind of depends. I have actually worked with a lot of construction real estate companies in the past, and in my former days as a consultant, and it depends on where you are in the value chain and how much kind of, some, I guess, construction companies are also developers, and then they buy or they construct and sell. Some construction companies just come in and do a bit of, you know, construction or advice. If you're not in the kind of in any way selling, if you're selling your services and you're, you know, you're the people actually working in construction, maybe some materials, that then you don't have to put into your use of sold products. But if you're in some way selling the actual final product, then you do. On the other hand, architects under the SBTi, and this is a kind of additional requirement the SBTi has on top of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, architects and kind of anyone else involved in building design, which could also kind of bleed into construction sometimes, they do actually have to account for those emissions because they have that upfront influence. At the SBTi, we do have an ongoing sector development project on the built environment. So that encompasses cement, steel, and then the wider built environment of more focused on buildings, which is ongoing at the moment, and quite a long project because it's of the kind of complex value chain of that sector. And it's not to say that construction companies wouldn't have to account for those emissions in the future. So I think just as much ties as you know, companies in that sector can make between different actors in the value chain and sharing of data, I think will probably set companies up for the future, because I wouldn't say it's implausible that might be included, if it is included as it is included at the moment for architects.
Thanks, Emma. Okay, we're rapidly running out of time. The question from Ying Qiang, I'm going to open it to the floor. If anybody's got software they can recommend that they're using, please pop it into the chat. I think it's, while there is undoubtedly some products out there that cover all of scope 3, I think probably to be most effective, you probably need to drill down more into different specific categories. I know, for example, in the transport and distribution categories, there's, you know, specific software available. We're going to try to answer
add
some of
on
these
that really
questions.
quickly. Sorry. So Forrester do a sustainability survey of software, and when they release it, it's free, so you can view it, and it's really comprehensive, just looking at all different types, what are the benefits, what are the setbacks. Unfortunately, I can't provide a link because I think you now have to pay for it, but yeah, worth checking out kind of providers that do analysis of different software providers.
We'll try and find that in the, yeah, Mark.
I was going to add a sort of tangential point. So it's you know, a lot of these tools now are starting to help you get data from the supply chain, which is a key piece. It's not just about the data and the measurement and tracking it. So I know, for example, in agriculture, where, you know, there's a lot of pressure now that for farmers to share data about what they're doing on the farm. And there's actually quite a lot of concerns around, you know, if I share that data back up the supply chain, how is that going to be used to manage me and drive me? And what does that mean in terms of expectations on me? So there's a kind of power dynamic around the data to think about.
We made today's webinar longer and clearly still not long enough. I'm just going to have to say thank you. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everyone, for such fantastic questions. We're going to do our best to answer them and include maybe an appendix to our key takeaways this time. I'm particularly sorry, Max. I really wanted you were the first question to go up in the Q&A, and it looks like we're just not going to manage it. I'm handing back quickly to Patrick to just run through the couple of upcoming events. But thanks everyone once again for your great participation today.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks for all of the great insights from the panelists as well today, and also the audience for those brilliant questions. Yeah, as Steve says, there's so many unanswered, so we'll definitely try our best to answer some of those along with the key takeaways. Just to let you know about a few more events that we've got coming up. So the penultimate event in this series, purchase goods and services and capital goods. So that's next week, 23rd of June, and that one's an hour and a half this time. So a little bit more time to hopefully answer some more of the questions. So feel free to scan that QR code and register for that. Additionally, as part of London Climate Action Week, we've got an event looking at investor perspectives on climate and human rights. So that's the 27th of June, 2 till 15:50. Going on to the next slide, the last event I want to flag is part of our Pride Plus, Building LGBTIQ plus Inclusive Business series, and we'll be looking at Authentic allyship in that one on the 29th of June from 1 till 2:30. So thanks again to everyone. Thanks to the speakers, thanks Steve, thanks to the audience as well. I look forward to seeing you at the purchase goods and services session. Have a good rest of your day.